Alrighty, 22nd of July, 2025. Next day after all of that. And so I mentioned that I would record the translators and editorial note, which might not seem important, but they really help to understand like what are the different voices that are going on here. And I don't know, I recorded on the whole introduction, and so this would be the only part that was really left out. And so it would feel incomplete without including a bit of this. So I'm just going to leave it here, and it can help to unpack more deeply what the heck is going on in the text itself. So translators note, Mark Kybers, John Peck, and Sonu Shamdasani. At the outset of Liber Novus, the Red Book, Jung experiences a crisis of language. The spirit of the depths who immediately challenges Jung's use of language, along with the spirit of the time, informs Jung that on the terrain of his soul, his achieved language will no longer serve. His own powers of knowing and speaking can no longer account for why he utters what he says, or under what compulsion he speaks. All such attempts become arbitrary in the depth realm, even murderous. He is made to understand that what he might say on these occasions is both madness and instructively what is. What he might say on these occasions is both madness and instructively what is. Indeed, in a broader perspective, the language that he will find for his inner experience would compose a vast commedia, in the sense of Dante's commedia. Quote, do you believe, man of this time, that laughter is lower than worship? Where's your measure, false measurer? The sum of life decides in laughter and in worship, not your judgment. So there's something deliberately comedic coming through him, the language that he finds to speak. That's what I've understood from that. It has a comedic quality. In translating this accumulated record of Jung's imaginal encounters with his inner images from a 16-year period beginning just before the First World War, we have let Jung remain a man who was pulled loose from his moorings, but also caught up in the maelstrom that has gone by the name of literary modernism. We have tried neither to further modernize nor to render more archaic the language and forms in which he couched his personal record. The language in Liber Novus, the Red Book, pursues three main stylistic registers, and each poses distinct difficulties for a translator. One of them faithfully reports the fantasies and inner dialogues of Jung's imaginal encounters, while a second remains firmly and discerningly conceptual. Still a third writes in a mantic and prophetic, or romantic and dithyrambic mode. I'm going to help us by defining these terms. Fine, mantic. Relating to divination or prophecy, so to speech which is prophetic. Yes, mantic or prophetic. So mantic seems to be, yeah, relating to divination. Mantic predictions. It refers to powers of divination and the speech that kind of speech that goes along with powers of divination. And then dithyrambic. Google doesn't even recognize the word. Give me 1 second. Dithyrambic means wildly enthused or passionate, so it's sort of a Dionysian form of speech. Okay, so again, we have three different voices. One of them faithfully reporting the fantasies and inner dialogues of his imaginal encounters, a second remaining firmly and discerningly conceptual, and a third voice writing in a mantic and prophetic or romantic and dithyrambic mode. The relation between these reportorial, meaning reporting, reflective and romantic aspects of Jung's language remains comedic in a manner that Dante or Goethe would have recognized. That is, within each chapter, the descriptive, conceptual, and mantic registers consistently rub against each other, while at the same time, no single register is affected by its partners. All three stylistic registers serve psychic promptings And each chapter shares a polyphonic mode with the others. Again, to help us, or maybe it's just me, define polyphonic. Yeah, many sounds or voices. In the scrutinies section from 1917, this polyphony matures, its voices commingling in various ratios. So again, the Red Book is structured in a form which is Liber Novus, book the first, Liber Secundus, book the second, and then the scrutinies section. A reader will quickly infer that this design was not premeditated, but rather grew from the experiment to which Jung arduously submitted. The editorial note, diagrams, this is the translator's note, the editorial note comes next. That editorial note diagrams the textual evolution of this composition. Such complicated language to describe something which doesn't need to be that complicated. Anyway, here we need only observe that Jung each time sets down an initial protocol layer. He sets down an initial protocol layer of narrative encounter, usually with dialogue. And then in the second layer, a lyrical elaboration of and commentary on that encounter. The first layer avoids an elevated tone, whereas the second welcomes elevation and modulates into sermonic, mantic prophetic reflections on the episode's meaning, which in turn unpack events discursively. This mode of composition, which is unique in Jung's works, was no temperamental arrangement. Instead, as the episodes accumulated and their stakes mounted, it grew into an experiment that was as much literary as it was psychological and spiritual. In Jung's extensive published and unpublished corpus, there is no other text that was subjected to such careful and continual linguistic revision as Liber Novus. These three linguistic registers already present themselves as virtual models for a possible translation. Our practice has been to let them cohabit within the exploratory frameworks alive in Jung's own day. The task before him was to find a language. The task before him was to find a language rather than use one ready at hand. The mantic and conceptual registers can themselves be considered as translations of the descriptive register. That is, these registers move from a literal level to symbolic ones that amplify it in a modern analog to Dante's Modi Diversi, or Modi Diversi, I'm not sure, in his letter to Can Grande della Scala, whoever that is. In a very real sense, Liber Novus was composed through intertextual translation. The book's rhetoric, its manner of address, emerges from this interanimating structure of internal translation or transvaluation. A critical task for any translation of the work, therefore, is conveying this compositional texture intact. The fact that painted images of an accomplished and hybrid kind eliminate the medieval format of a folio in scribal hand compounds any reflections on the linguistic task. As in, there are drawings too. The novel language required a renewed ancient script. A polyphonic style couches itself, multimedia fashion, within a symbolic, throwback yet forward movement, medieval and anticipatory, into retrievals of psychic reality. Verbal and visual images press in on Jung from the root past and present, while aiming toward the beyond. A layered medium emerges, whose polyphonic style mirrors within its language that same composite layering. Clearly, what they're trying to do is emulate Jung in this piece, and it's just kind of like annoyingly complicating what doesn't need to be so complicated. Sorry, but it's just ugh. Faced with the task of translating a text composed nearly 100 years ago, Translators usually have the benefit of prior models to consult, as well as decades of scholarly commentary and criticism. Without such exemplars at hand, we were left to imagine how the work might have been translated in previous decades. Consequently, our translation sidesteps several unpublished or hypothetical models for rendering Liber Novus into English. There is Peter Bain's strikingly archaizing Septem Sermons, Seven Sermons of the Dead, of 1925, which draws largely on a Victorian idiom, or the conceptually rationalizing version that R.C.F. Hall might have attempted, had he been allowed to translate it alongside his other volumes in the Bologen series of Jung's collected works. Or the elegant literary rendering from the hand of someone like R.J. Hollingdale, translated of Nietzsche. Our version, therefore, occupies an actual position in a largely virtual sequence. Consideration of these virtual models highlighted questions of how to pitch the language within historical shifts in English prose, how to convey the myriad convergences and divergences between the language of Liber Novus and Jung's collected works, and how to render in English a work simultaneously echoing Luther's German and Nietzsche's parody of the same in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Because our version takes this position, accordingly, when we have cited Jung's collected works, we have freshly rendered or discreetly modified the published translations. Liber Novus was co-eval with the literary ferment that Mikhail Bakhtin called the dialogical prose imagination. The Anglo-Welsh writer and artist David Jones, author of In Parentheses and The Anathemata, referred to the rupture of the First World War and its effects on the historical sense of writers, artists, and thinkers simply as the break. In concert with other experimental writing from these decades, Liber Novus excavates archaeological layers of literary adventure. With hard-won consciousness as both shovel and precious, with hard-won consciousness as both shovel and precious shard. While Jung actively considered publishing Liber Novus for many years, he chose not to make a name for himself in this literary manner, as much for style as for content, by releasing it. By 1921, with Psychological Types, he already found that his sanctum could furnish him his main themes, although through translation into a scholarly idiom. Jung enunciates the tension among his three stylistic registers, already addressing a future readership, which shifts from an inner circle of friends to a wider public between different layers of the text. This is graphically apparent in the frequent pronomial shifts between the versions, which show the manner in which he was constantly reimagining the potential readers of the text. Jung coherently adopted this dialogical stance, polyphonic in Bakhtin's later terms, once again mindful of a hypothetical future audience, yet also aloof from the question of audience altogether, not from pride, but simply in view of the aims to be served. Paintings and fantasies from this private treasury entered anonymously as cryptid intertexts into Jung's later work, nestling as hermetic clues to the undisclosed whole of his effort. Indeed, we can imagine Jung laughing when he wrote of 3, case Z, in the last section of his essay on the psychological aspects of the Chore, 1971. There he summarizes as anonymous 12 episodes from encounters with his own soul in Liber Novus, calling them a dream series. The comments he appends to these propel the adventurer he had been, and the subject he became in that adventure, into the discourse of a would-be science. The comedy is both spacious and exquisite. This respectful host to the anima also wields the diagnostic pointer in all seriousness. His language flexibly straddled both contexts, but also kept certain veils in place while doing so. This linguistic strategy mirrored Jung's larger aims in remaining fruitfully dual and contextual, declaring his mysteries to be particular, not to be aped in any way. He nonetheless also offered them as a template of formative spiritual process, and in doing so, attempted to develop an idiom that could be taken up by others to articulate their experiences. This is one way of paraphrasing the considerable anomaly of the language that Jung had to find through sleepless nights from 1913 onward. That language shifted its shape, altered its scale, and weighed both megrims, and tons. Megrim, depression, low spirits, a whim or fancy. Therefore, it comes as no surprise that in his more elevated passages, Jung relied on the resonance of the Luther Bible, itself a translation that had achieved rock-like stability within German culture. Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress. Thus, our own reliance here on the King James Version of the Bible for comparable tonalities in English. Yet a paradox rises immediately. What Jung counted on in that resonance had transplanted an alien spirit into the Germanic Heimat or home. As one might likewise say of the King James Bible's deep embedding of the same implant in Anglo-Saxon culture. Franz Rosenzweig, translating parts of the Old Testament with Martin Buber in the mid-1920s, identified Luther's Bible as the great spacemaker within Germanic spirit, precisely through Luther's close-in moves toward his source. Quote, "For the comfort of our souls, we must retain such words, must put up with them, and so give the Hebrew some room where it does better than German can." Thus, our own practice of not smoothing out Jung's several modes, or making them run more fluently than need be, or even regularizing his punctuation. Think of Dante's shaggy diction, or of still another maxim from Luther in Rosenzweig's notes: "The mud will cling to the wheel." Yet even these profound allowances for archaic and original speech across abysses of meaning fail to approximate the destabilizing experience in and through language to which Jung testifies. His later comments in the published memoir on his reservations about high-flown style, in effect, cover his tracks in Liber Novus. The original experience sent speech into a spin that animates the book's initiatic dimension. Language, too, undergoes a descent into hell and the realm of the dead, which divests one of speech even as it renews the capacity for utterance. The following instances give some idea of this factor's range, mapping the stresses in any sincere ventriloquism, such as Jung risked, by undertaking a controlled séance with himself and his ground, with pen in hand. Hölderlin's hair-breadth space warps, and Isaiah's tongue-born burning coal both move in this league, along with Plato on right frenzy or divine madness. So it's going to give a series of examples which describe the extent of different styles of language, let's just say, that are shown in the Red Book. 7 different instances. 1, quote, "My soul spoke to me in a whisper, urgently and alarmingly. Words, words, do not make too many words. Be silent and listen. Have you recognized your madness, and do you admit it? Have you noticed that all your foundations are all completely mired in madness?" 2, young soul. "There are hellish webs of words, only words. Be tentative with words. Value them. For you are the first who get snared in them. For words have meanings. With words you pull up the underworld. Word, the paltriest and the mightiest. In words, the emptiness and the fullness flow together. Hence the word is an image of the God." 3. But if the word is a symbol, it means everything. When the way enters death, and we are surrounded by rot and horror, the way arises in the darkness, and leaves the mouth as the saving symbol, the word. 4. The dead woman. "Let me have the word. Oh, that you cannot hear. How difficult. Give me the word." It then materializes in Jung's hand as HAP, the phallus. 5. Jung soul. "You possess the word that should not be allowed to remain concealed." 6. Jung. What is my word? It is the stammering of a minor soul. They do not see the fire, they do not believe your words, but they see your mark and unknowingly suspect you to be the messenger of the burning agony. You stutter, you stammer. In the protocols for his memoir, Jung recalls bringing to the original experiences in Liber Novus only a highly clumsy speech. Yet one instance, 7, strongly belies that later emphasis. Quote, I knew that Philemon had intoxicated me and given me a language that was foreign to me and of a different sensitivity. All of this faded when the god arose, and only Philemon kept that language. This last instance indicates that Jung later attributed the mantic dithyrambic speech of layer 2 in everything before the scrutinies section to Philemon. The literal intoxication described here is linguistic, a dramatized ventriloquial version of Platonic divine madness. It therefore underscores our attempt to faithfully render the stylistic registers of Liber Novus so as to present a vital aspect of Jung's literary experiment, as he grapples with attempting to find the most fitting idiom in which to cast the transformations of inner experience. Jung's search for the soul, then, stands at one with the search for appropriately dialogical and differentiated language. These instances, in all their oscillations, affect a reading of Jung's collected works and counsel caution with applying its conceptual tools to the task of reading and understanding Liber Novus. To take but one example, one begins to see that it is too neat to equate the opposed yet related depths of Logos and Eros with the conceptual and lyric mantic registers found in Liber Novus. Jung's commentary on the Elijah-Salome relationship, included here, shows that relationship to be developmental, a mystery play of the formative process that kindles love for the lowest in us. The modal span for language in Liber Novus thus animates that mystery play, but does not correspond directly to opposed psychological functions. This complex respect for language instructs translators of Liber Novus in navigating the underworld redemptive tensions, the underworld/redemptive tensions spanned by its rhetoric. The great force behind the mantic tension in that rhetoric occupied Jung in the brief epilogue he inscribed in the calligraphic volume in 1959, 2 years before his death. Once again, plying the seas of those illuminated pages, he seems to have found any further summing up to be unnecessary. Breaking off in mid-sentence, he left the book to stand on its own as one strand of discourse within his whole effort. That counterpoint required no comment, any more than did the 3 registers of language within the book itself. Odile was Commedia after all, calling for no retrospective theoretical justification. Liber Novus would survive the gropings and peltings of reception. Jung had remarked in 1957 to Amelia Jaffe that so much rubbish had been said about him that any more shouldn't disturb him. That lifted pen therefore confidently consigned the book to its depth trajectory, steeply expanding into the quarry it had become, with both his collected works and the lakeside tower at Bollingen as its final extractions. In this note, we have attempted to convey only the general principles that have guided this translation. A full discussion of the choices that confronted us and a justification of the decisions taken would fill a volume as ample as this one. Now, briefly, the editorial note, which directly follows from that translator's note, it is not quite as long. Editorial note Sonu Shamdasani. Liber Novus is an unfinished manuscript corpus, and it is not completely clear how Jung intended to complete it, or how he would have published it, had he decided to do so. We have a series of manuscripts, of which no single version can be taken as final. Consequently, the text could be presented in a variety of ways, This note indicates the editorial rationale behind the present edition. The following is the sequence of extant manuscripts for Liber Primus and Liber Secundus, meaning book the first and book the second of the Red Book. The sequence of extant manuscripts. Yeah. Black Books 2 to 5, from November 13 to April 1914. Handwritten draft, from summer 1914 to 1915. Typed draft, circa 1915. Corrected draft, with one layer of changes circa 1915, one layer of changes circa mid-1920s. The calligraphic volume, 1915 to 1930, resumed in 1959 and left incomplete. Carey Baines transcription, from 1924 to 1925. The Yale manuscript of Liber Primus minus the prologue, identical with the typed draft. The copy-edited draft of Liber Primus minus the prologue, with corrections in unknown hands, circa late 1950s, and the edited version of the typed draft. And the following is a sequence of extant manuscripts for the scrutiny section, which follow from Liber Primus and Liber Secundus. Namely, Black Books 5 to 6, from April 1914 to June 1916. The calligraphic Septem Sermons, 7 Sermons of the Dead, 1916. The printed Septem Sermons from 1916. The handwritten draft, circa 1917. The typed draft, circa 1918. And Carey Baines' transcription, 1925, of 27 pages and incomplete. The arrangement presented here starts with a revision of Carey Baines' transcription and a fresh transcription of the remaining material in the calligraphic volume, together with the typed draft of scrutinies, with line-by-line comparisons with all extant versions. The last 30 pages are completed from the draft. The main variations between the different manuscripts concern the second layer of the text. These changes represent Jung's continued work of comprehending the psychological significance of the fantasies. As Jung considered Liber Novus to be an attempt at an elaboration in terms of the revelation, the changes between the different versions present this attempt at an elaboration, and therefore are an important part of the work itself. Thus, the notes indicate significant changes between the different versions, and they present material that clarifies the meaning or context of a particular section. Each manuscript layer is important and interesting, and a publication of all of them, which would run to several thousand pages, would be a task for the future. The criterion for including passages from the earlier manuscripts has been simply the question, does this inclusion help the reader comprehend what is taking place? Aside from the intrinsic importance of these changes, noting them in the footnotes serves a second purpose. It shows how carefully Jung worked at continually revising the text. The corrected draft has 2 layers of correction by Jung. The first set of corrections appears to have been done after the draft was typed and before the transcription into the calligraphic volume, as it appears that it was this manuscript that Jung transcribed. A further set of corrections on approximately 200 pages of the typescript appears to have been made after the calligraphic volume, and I would estimate that these were done sometime in the mid-1920s. These corrections modernize the language and bring the terminology into relation with Jung's terminology from the period of psychological types. Additional clarifications are also added. Jung even corrected material in the draft that was deleted in the calligraphic volume. I've presented some of the significant changes in the footnotes. From them, it is possible for a reader to see how Jung would have revised the whole text had he completed this layer of corrections. Subdivisions have been added in Liber Secundus, chapter 21, The Magician, and in Scrutinies, for ease of reference. These are indicated in scrolled brackets. Where possible, the date of each fantasy has been given from the Black Books. The second layer added in the draft is indicated by 2 in square brackets, and the manuscript reverts to the sequence of the fantasies in the Black Books at the beginning of the following chapter. In the passages where subdivisions have been added, the reversion to the sequence of the black books is indicated by 1 in square brackets. The various manuscripts have different systems of paragraphing. In the draft, paragraphs often consist of 1 or 2 sentences, and the text is presented like a prose poem. At the other extreme, in the calligraphic volume, there are lengthy passages of text with no paragraph breaks. The most logical paraphrasing appears in Kay Bain's transcription. She frequently took her cue for paragraph breaks from the presence of colored initials. Because it is unlikely that she would have reparagraphed the text without Jung's approval, her layout has formed the point of departure for this edition. In some instances, the paragraphing has been brought closer into line with the draft and the calligraphic volume. In the second half of her transcription, Carrie Baines transcribed the draft because the calligraphic volume had not been completed. Here I've paragraphed the text in the same manner as established before. I believe that this presents the text in the clearest and easiest to follow form. In the calligraphic volume, Jung illustrated certain initials and wrote some in red and blue, and sometimes increased the font of the text. The layout here attempts to follow these conventions. Because the initials in question aren't always the same in English and German, the choice of which initial to set in red in English has been governed by its corresponding location in the text. The bolding and increase of font size has been rendered by italics. The remainder of the text beyond that which Jung transcribed in the calligraphic volume has been set following the same conventions to maintain consistency. In the case of the Septem Sermons, the font coloring has followed Jung's printed version of 1916. The decision to include scrutinies in sequence with and as part of Liber Novus is based on the following editorial rationale. The material in the Black Books commences in November 1913. Liber Secundus closes with material from April 19, 1914, and Scrutinies commences with material from the same day. The Black Books run consecutively until July 21, 1914, and recommence on June 3, 1915. In the hiatus, Jung wrote the handwritten draft. When Carrie Baines transcribed Liber Novus between 1924 and 1925, the first half of her transcription followed Liber Novus itself, to the point reached by Jung in his own transcription into the calligraphic volume. It continues by following the draft, and then proceeds 27 pages into Scrutinies, ending mid-sentence. At the end of Liber Secundus, Jung's soul has ascended to heaven, following the reborn God. Jung now thinks that Philemon is a charlatan, and comes to his I, whom he must live with and educate. Scrutinies continues directly from this point with a confrontation with his I. The ascent of the reborn God is referred to, and his soul returns and explains why she had disappeared. Philemon reappears and instructs Jung on how to establish the right relation to his soul, the dead, the gods, and the daemons. In Scrutinies, Philemon fully merges and takes on the significance that Jung attached to him both in the 1925 seminar and in Memories, as in Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Only in Scrutinies do certain episodes in Liber Primus and Liber Secundus become clear. By the same token, the narrative in Scrutinies makes no sense if one has not read Liber Primus and Liber Secundus. At 2 places in Scrutinies, Liber Primus and Liber Secundus are mentioned in a way that strongly suggests that they are all part of the same work. Quote, and then the war broke out. This opened my eyes about what I had experienced before, and it also gave me the courage to say all that I have written in the earlier part of this book. Since the god has ascended to the upper realms, Philemon has also become different. He first appeared to me as a magician who lived in a distant land, but then I felt his nearness, and since the god has ascended, I knew that Philemon had intoxicated me and given me a language that was foreign to me and of a different sensitivity. All of this faded when the god arose, and only Philemon kept that language, but I felt that he went on other ways than I did. Probably the greater part of what I've written in the earlier part of this book was given to me by Philemon. These references to the earlier part of the book suggest that all this indeed constitutes one book, and that Scrutinies was considered by Jung to be part of Liber Novus. This view is supported by the number of internal corrections between the texts. One example is the fact that the mandalas in Liber Novus are closely connected to the experience of the self, and the realization of its centrality depicted only in Scrutinies. Another example occurs in Liber Secundus, chapter 15, when Ezekiel and his fellow Anabaptists arrive. They tell Jung that they are going to Jerusalem's holy places because they are not at peace, not having fully finished with life. In scrutinies, the dead reappear, telling Jung that they have been to Jerusalem, but did not find what they sought there. At that point, Philemon appears, and the septum sermons begin. Perhaps Jung intended to transcribe scrutinies into the calligraphic volume and illustrate it. There are ample blank pages. On January 8, 1958, Carrie Baines asked Jung, "Do you remember that you had me copy quite a bit of the Red Book itself while you were in Africa?" I got as far as the beginning of the scrutinies. This goes beyond what Frau Schaff had put at Kurt Wolff's disposal, and he would like to read it. Is that okay? Right. Jung replied, "I have no objections against your lending your notes of the Red Book to Mr. Wolff." Yeah, here Carrie Baines too seems to regard scrutinies as part of the Red Book. In citations in the notes, ellipses have been indicated by 3 periods. No emphases have been added. That being the editorial note, go along with the translator's note to Sonu Shamdashani's, excuse me, Shamdasani, uh, his publication, his version of the Red Book, published in 2009.